What is going on, gents? It's R.P.M. here, reporting from my secret bunker on the plantation. Now, before I get into this article, I'm not going to be my usual animated self because I want this video to be shared far and wide. It is absolutely crucial at this point that things need to be put into place to help men who are being abused in relationships. Now, the internet has been on fire for the last few weeks about Johnny Depp, who was being abused at the hands of Amber Heard. Now, it has come to light that Lamar Odom is also being physically abused by his girlfriend. Now, one question that is intentionally not put out to the public is, where do abused men have to go? Well, I'm going to send a special shout out to Drums McBashington, who dropped this article and the name of a man in my comment section over on BitChute. Now, this article was published on April 28th, 2013. Man who ran Canada's only shelter dedicated solely to male victims of domestic abuse dies in apparent suicide. The man who created Canada's only shelter solely dedicated to male victims of domestic violence died Friday of an apparent suicide. The day after he packed up his recently sold home. Also, the site of the men's alternative safe house, Earl Silverman, was found hanging in his garage. 20 years ago, Earl Silverman of Calgary fled his home to escape violence from his abusive wife. He had no refuge to take shelter in. There were plenty of shelters for women victims of domestic abuse, but for men, the only publicly funded services were for anger management. The message was clear to Silverman. As a victim, I was re-victimized by having these services telling me I wasn't a victim, but I was a perpetrator. 3 years ago, in his own home, Silverman opened the men's alternative safe house, MASH, which until last week held the distinction of being the only privately funded shelter for male victims of domestic abuse in Canada. Now, with no public funds to help, the maintenance and grocery bills associated with running his shelter became too onerous for him to handle. Silverman has sold his home. Mr. Silverman closed his shelter last month, saying he could no longer afford its upkeep. He long sought funding from provincial and federal governments to help run his hybrid shelter and home, but believed he was always refused because the space was dedicated to helping male victims and their children. He said he was unable to pay for heat and grocery bills. Stephen Howard purchased Mr. Silverman's home and said he helped the advocate moved his belongings on Thursday. I couldn't have predicted this. I got the sense that he was pretty frustrated that the shelter didn't work out. He was frustrated with the government that he didn't get any help, Mr. Howard said on Saturday. Mr. Silverman told the house's new tenant that he had plans to stay with friends in other parts of the country. Mr. Howard came back to the house the next day and found only Mr. Silverman's roommate. We got talking about keys, and he said, "I think this is the garage, and this is the front door and whatnot," Mr. Howard said. I said I would go try the garage, but the door was already open. That's when I found him there. Mr. Howard said they called for help, but it was far too late. Mr. Silverman's brown house in an established neighborhood northeast of Calgary held little more than a few white boxes and a backyard stuffed with torn single mattresses and old bedroom furniture from his shelter. Several weeks ago, he told the Post that he himself had been the victim of abuse at the hands of his ex-wife. His experience inspired him to become involved in men's rights groups and MASH. When I went into the community looking for some support services, I couldn't find any. There were a lot for women, and the only programs for men were for anger management, Mr. Silverman told the Post shortly before his death. As a victim, I was re-victimized by having these services telling me that I was not a victim, but I was a perpetrator. After he left his wife more than 20 years ago, Mr. Silverman said he spiraled into self-abuse, living on Johnny Walker and cigarettes. I basically tried to commit suicide because I couldn't do anything. Tom Maddie lived in Mr. Silverman's basement for the past several months. I knew Earl was battling a lot of demons. Him and me could get along well because I was battling a lot of the same ones. He hit a point where it just became too much. Mr. Maddie said, "I don't know what to tell you. It comes as a bit of a surprise." Both Mr. Howard and Mr. Maddie said Mr. Silverman left a 4-page suicide note blaming the government for failing to recognize male victims of domestic abuse. Earl understood that the first step to helping people recover from things like domestic abuse is providing them with that low-level, safe place to be. Mr. Maddie said, MASH opened about 3 years ago, and the shelter hosted more than 20 men fleeing abusive situations, including some children. He was a very caring person, very emotional, very direct, and honest. He believed very much in fairness and justice, and he was just staggered constantly that over a period of 20 years, that something that is so simple and so logical as gender rights and equality would be so impossible to access for many people, Mr. Maddie said. Mr. Silverman was a well-known and outspoken member of the men's rights community. His death has sparked outrage and sadness among those who are pushing for greater recognition of men's issues in law and family court. An online radio station called A Voice for Men broadcast a tribute to Mr. Silverman on Saturday night, said James Huffs, the director of operations. He meant a lot to those in Canada, specifically, Mr. Huffs said. He was the only person in Canada who had the dream of doing what he did. He was the only guy to recognize a problem with the fact that men were not receiving the type of support they needed to overcome domestic violence situations. In his note, Mr. Silverman also said he hoped his death would bring more awareness to the issue of male abuse. He left no family. Gentlemen, it is crucial that men get the proper help in domestic violence situations. Now, we all know that the Duluth model is pretty much a sword and shield that a lot of women utilize. In the recordings of Amber Heard, she is heard absolutely mentally abusing him, gaslighting him, calling him a baby, admitting to being physical, saying that she can't promise that she's not going to be physical. But yet, where did Johnny Depp have to go? Where could he turn? Why is it that men of today need to be punished for what men did centuries ago? The answer to that question always escapes me. Now, you would think that the term equality would be put into play, fairness. However, it is not. Because let's ask the real question here. What are the socially accepted options for men who are being abused in relationships? Option 1, stay there, take it, suffer in silence. Because through some twist, I think we've fallen into bizarro land with this one, but abused men are outright treated like somehow we had it coming. When a woman hits a man, the first thing that society is programmed to ask is, well, what did he do to hit her? Or excuse me, what did he do to deserve her hitting him? We never sit back and say, well, you know what? That's wrong. People shouldn't hit people. People should keep their hands to themselves. Now, the second socially acceptable thing for men to do, and I'm using socially acceptable in air quotes, is actually reach out to the legal system to try to get help, only to have the Duluth model come in and take the man off to jail. Yeah. Now, unfortunately, there is a third option, but that option usually involves a hockey mask. That's all I'm going to say on that one. But yeah, the issue of men being abused in relationships is something that no one is willing to take on. The whole hashtag justice for Johnny is trending. However, there have been no actual visible tangibles put in place to say, men, if you're being abused in your relationship, this is where you can go. This whole call-in hotlines and anger managements, that's not good enough. And men need to stand up and say, we need our own safe space when we are being abused. That's what we need. But as we all know, anytime men actually do want to have a space to ourselves, it has to be infiltrated and broken up. And it's really, really sad. It truly is. So I've just been sitting back, watching, waiting, seeing if anything was actually going to happen. How far is this conversation of male victims of domestic abuse going to go? Unfortunately, the reality is it's going to trend for a while, and then like everything else, it's going to be lost like a fart in the wind. Well, spread this video as far as you can, because the issue of male domestic violence victims is not going to go away anytime soon. We all know the stats of how non-reciprocated violence is done primarily by women. And we have to get off of this mind state, or should I say, this brainwashing that men are always the perpetrators. We truly need a fair system that says, look, we're going to sit down, we're going to investigate this, we're going to weigh the evidence, and we're going to put the appropriate person behind bars, male or female. Well, gentlemen, let me know what you guys think. That's all I got to say for this one. R.P.M. I am